Thank you very much. Appreciate your seat taking. Excellent. It was good to hear so much chatter in the break. Hope we can continue the conversations as we go on. That first panel was really useful for understanding the diversity and scope of emission sources related to military activities. In the second panel, we're going to drill down a little bit more closely into scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So that's fuel use, stationary and mobile fuel use primarily. And we have an extremely good and august panel to join us here. So to my left, we have Stuart Parkinson, we have Clare, we have Axel Michaelowa, and we have Oliver Heidrich. And on the TV, I hope we have Neta Crawford, our would-be host. We was Oxford today, but we're not. And unfortunately, Neta is joining us from the US, but very grateful that she can. Neta, you might want to just say a few words of welcome before you speak, but I'll hand over to you. 12 minutes each. I'll be extremely ruthless with timing, so we have time for Q&A at the end. Yeah, Neta, if you'd like to take it away.
Can you hear me in the room? Okay, excellent. Thank you. Well, look, we have just settled a strike here in the United States of the Writers Guild, and one day maybe academics will have settled their own disputes with universities. But sadly, the writers weren't able to get to me in time to improve my remarks, so I'll just have to wing it. I really glad that you're all in Oxford. I would have preferred to host you at the university. I chose, after we made the decision, or as we were making the decision, not to be at the university, to remain in the US with family who, one of whom is quite ill. Okay, so welcome to Oxford. I'll just quickly say a few words about the US as the largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases, and also then talk a little bit about some context for that. So most of US military emissions are, of course, are operational, about 70%, and about 30% is for installations. And of course, this varies with activity. In the immediate post-Vietnam War era, it was 109 million metric tons that year, post-war 1975 emissions. Then they declined a little bit and went up in the Cold War with the Reagan buildup and increasing exercises in Europe. And then they declined with the end of the Cold War, thankfully, with the decrease in military bases, going from about 2,000 to 1,000 over a decade, and then that is overseas military bases, and then increased again with the post 9/11 wars, with the increase in tempo of activity for especially the Air Force. So most operational emissions, as I've just actually suggested, are aircraft. That is the bulk of the operational emissions by greenhouse gas. Now, the other declines there's a sort of secular decline in US military emissions due to a few other things. One is a decrease in the use of coal, like the rest of the world turning to natural gas. The military switch in the US to all nuclear submarines and a surface fleet, the aircraft carrier fleet. The rest of the Navy, of course, remains on naval fuel. A small amount of this decrease is due to the increasing use of alternative fuels and better efficiencies, but efficiency per pound, I'm skeptical of. Okay, so there are things we don't know about the US military's emissions, including, in fact, all emissions, and you've probably discussed this in the panel previously. It's 6 in the morning here. I didn't actually get up for all of that. So the effect of water vapor is important, given that most US operational emissions are from aircraft, the bulk of them, and also the fact that the United States military is kind of sui generis in that we rely so much, the US military relies so much on air power, both for demonstration, coercive diplomacy, and also obviously for operations, sort of softening up countries before it bombs them and invades on land. Okay, so I haven't also got a sense of all of the bases overseas. I don't know, I'm not sure that we do know what the overseas bases contribution is, since some of the emissions from overseas bases will be in the country reports of the places where the bases are located. So the most important thing I'm saying about what we don't know is we need to realize that what we don't know is very large, in the sense that there could be a significant radiative forcing effect from the operations of aircraft. So I will say something about military industrial emissions. That's not the focus of my remarks, but they're obviously related to operations. And for the United States, because it is the world's, at least the Western world's arsenal, military emissions are from military industrial emissions are extremely important. There's a large sector of the US industrial, the manufacturing economy, which is related to military industry. And there'll be some need to think about how to convert those jobs and activities. Okay, now I've suggested the United States is sui generis in some respects. First way, it's so active, militarily active, with about 750 permanent installations and bases remaining in the world, between 750 and 850, and those fluctuate, and they're moving somewhat away from Central Command to Asia and the Pacific. Secondly, the United States spending is essential, military spending is essentially unmoored to its activities. Now, this might be surprising. Most countries in the world have a tighter relationship between their military spending, their operations, and therefore their emissions. But US military spending tends to increase much more consistently than one would expect. When US military spending goes up in every year except one during the post 9/11 wars, despite the fact that US operations fluctuated a great deal during the post 9/11 wars, that suggests to you that you cannot use military spending as a very good approximator of emissions, at least for this country. And I think that's important to keep in mind. It could be that military spending is a good indicator of overall emissions for most other countries in the world, but not for the US. And then we can talk about the political reasons for that if you're interested. Then, of course, this is all the spending and the operations and the training and the bases are related to assessment of threats in US grand strategy. US grand strategy is preeminence, dominance, it's winning, okay, to protect US interests and counter threats to US interest. Unfortunately, the United States, I'll argue, is in a cycle of threat inflation with regard to China. Having lived through not just the end of the Vietnam War, but the Cold War and the end of the Cold War, I can tell you that this threat inflation is pernicious and consistent. It's not unusual in the US. Another way that the United States is perhaps sui generis is its over-reliance, I think, but certainly a reliance on air power. And it's not just the Air Force, it's naval air, and that's on the aircraft carriers. And of course, the other ways that air power is used from the middle of the country, flying from Monmouth all the way to the Persian Gulf and back, that's quite a feat. Now, there are some opportunities here and some deeper concerns. The opportunities are, we have an opportunity to decrease legacy forces and reduce emissions at bases which are no longer required or which are unnecessary in certain respects. And we also have an opportunity to counter threat inflation. Now, that's not the job of this group to think about how to do that in line with US grant strategy, or if US grant strategy has to change, but it is something that should be kept in mind. Not every one of these installations or operations or elements of US grant strategy and military doctrine are necessary. And I'm working on that in a separate project. Okay, so the thing I want to finish on, however, is that something else has been happening with the US and its emissions. First of all, of course, the US military, in particular the Navy, has understood climate change since the 1950s and have factored it into their understanding of the world, focused on the Arctic in particular since the 1950s. But what's also happened in their understanding is there's been a change in the sense of the connection between climate change and conflict. So while it used to be the case that the environment and war people were sort of not in the same conversation as the climate change people, there's a climate change and conflict nexus which has emerged and solidified over the last, I'd say, 15 years. It's become almost a consensus that climate change will lead to increased instability and conflict. And the academic literature on that is both ambiguous and ambivalent, and the causal arrows are not necessarily firm or even unidirectional. In fact, climate change is caused, as we know, by military emissions, which are a significant portion of the world's emissions and have been for the last 200 years, more than 200 years. So the idea that the nexus between climate change and conflict has gone from possible to likely is an important factor in understanding how it is, again, US military spending and operations is, in a sense, unmoored from what I would suggest is a kind of base reality of what's necessary to do. So, of course, I haven't said anything about wartime emissions, nor the targeting of cities, and I think that's an important thing to think about as well. But I yield the rest of my time, if there is any time remaining, to the rest of you. Thank you. And I can't hear you if you were saying anything to me.
Okay. Great stuff. Thank you very much, Neta. If you can hear. Right, excuse me, just a little slightly. Take you last. Have you sent me the invite? Okay, cool. Yeah, sure. Okay, good. Oh, he's supposed to do this share screen. Great stuff. Thank you very much. Right, our next speaker today is Dr. Stuart Parkinson from Scientists for Global Responsibility. Stuart's an executive director and has a wide background, including research and advocacy on climate change, sustainable energy, and military and security issues. Stuart, over to you.
Or should I be using this one?
Have you shared the right screen? You've got to share. Right.
That's an interesting question.
I don't think you are.
Definitely.
And also, I can't do Zoom, so
Right, okay. We may well struggle in that case.
That one.
we'll struggle through it.
Yeah, online we can see the PowerPoint.
Okay,
It's just not on there.
right.
So I'm not sure I've done that. I think you need to maybe do an escape or something.
Don't delete my
Nightmares and cold sweats about this. It's right up there with all your teeth falling out.
So now you understand why I went without PowerPoint.
Stuart, we need to go to your bit. And then I need to go to Zoom. And new share. No, no, it's different.
Okay. Right.
Right.
Okay. And I can, yes, I can use this pointer. Right, wonderful. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about UK military carbon emissions, and I'm going to look in a little bit of detail at the data, the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions data. First, just in case you're not familiar with Scientists for Global Responsibility, we're a small research and advocacy organisation with a membership of a few hundred scientists and engineers in the UK. And we've worked on a range of issues, including climate change, military science and technology, and we're now doing quite a lot of work on military greenhouse gas emissions. We published 3 large reports, one of which you can get paper copies here, and 2 short technical papers on UK emissions, and several of these we've done with Conflict and Environment Observatory. So some of the results I'm going to talk about today were some of the research that was actually quoted in the House of Commons Defence Committee, the parliamentary report published last month. They took up a few of our findings and recommendations, particularly around military bases. So that was nice to see. Lots of other things we said they weren't so impressed by. So first set of data, UK military greenhouse gas emissions. So this is what the Ministry of Defence calls the estate, what in UN jargon is stationary emissions, but it's military bases, scope 1 and 2 emissions. You see there are 2 graphs there. The first one, the blue one, that's data stretching back to 2009 forward, and then there's been a revised data set published by the MOD for the last 5 years or so, and that resulted in a 40% increase in the estimate for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and I'm hoping James is going to give us a reason why that happened. But basically, so the first thing to show is that even militaries which have been measuring emissions for a while, there's still some data collection issues that need to be resolved, and I think we need to bear that in mind when considering the wider context. The other thing to say about this graph, there's a clear trend downwards. If we assume that the trends over the 2 periods are broadly in line with each other, it's around 65% reduction over that period, over that sort of 13-year period. So what might be the causes of those periods? Well, our analysis, we came up with 2 reasons which we think are the main ones. The first one was decarbonisation of the UK national grid. So the emissions per unit of electricity generated by the UK electricity grid, civilian grid, supplies UK bases, military bases. That's been declining since 2015, and that's fallen by about 57% up until 2022, due to a switch mainly away from coal and towards renewables. So that's a key factor. The other factor that we think is particularly significant is the reduction in the number of UK military personnel, and this was particularly a factor from 2010 onwards, when military cuts led to a reduction in military personnel of about 20%. And this accounts, if we go back to the first graph, you can see there's a steady decline there The decline in the latter period seems to be the electricity grid. The decline in the former period seems to be the decline in personnel. And what we see over that period is the energy use per soldier at military bases, electricity use and heating use and other energy uses is fairly constant. But what's happened is the electricity has been decarbonized and the number of soldiers have fallen. The last thing I want to say about the estate is the 2025 target, emissions target that the estate has in the UK. So you've got two graphs here, and this is a 30% reduction from 2017 levels by 2025. So the blue line is just a section of one of the curves I've just shown you, which is the actual reductions over the past 5 years or so. The orange line is the reductions just due to the decarbonisation of the national grid. So that's being done by a civilian agency. And you would see that that would hit, the MOD would hit its target in 2025 purely through that action, not its own actions. But it has done a few actions and it's hit the target a couple of years early. And what the parliamentary report said about this was the target is insufficiently demanding. And another reason why they said it's insufficiently demanding is when you looked at the similar targets for the civilian government departments that were covered by the same set of targets, they on average were about 50% over the period. So the MOD, even though it was the largest department, had a much weaker target. So moving to capability emissions. So this is emissions of military equipment, vehicles, vessels, warships, planes, tanks, etc. What the UN calls mobile emissions. We have some data here. This is a longer data set. So this covers from 1990. In official UK statistics, it's rather rare for national statistics to quote this level of detail, but they have emissions from military aircraft and military shipping over that period. So we have data approved by the National Office of National Statistics for that whole period. And that data shows a reduction in emissions of about 70% over that period. And then the MOD has been publishing more detailed data, which includes tanks and other armed vehicles, and that's the orange line there. So they've been doing that since 2010. And you can see that there's a slight anomaly in the 27 data where we seem to get carbon negative tanks because it drops below the one for ships and planes only. So I think there might be a mistake in that one. So there are, so as I said, so we have two main reasons that we think our analysis points to that what has affected this curve. The first one is around military activity and military spending broadly. So this is a curve, a graph of an MOD graph of military spending since the 1980s, and the top curve is constant in constant pounds, constant real prices, inflation adjusted. So you can see that the fall after the end of the Cold War, the rise again during the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, peaking, falling again after that, and then the latest rises being shown. So that's sort of, if you compare it with this graph, you can sort of see a decline in the 1990s, a bump in the mid-2000s, and a fall again. So that seems to explain the sort of ups and downs, but it doesn't really explain the trend. And what we think might be a better indicator of the trend is the number of large energy consuming pieces of equipment that the UK military is deploying over the period. So I've got some figures here, and I'm still digging into some of these figures. So particularly the aircraft ones, I want to check in more detail, but this is a conservative interpretation of the data that I've got. So you can see over this period of 30 years or so, large warships, the number of large warships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates fell about 60%. Number of large combat aircraft fell about 60%. The number of large tanks fell about 60%. So together with the sort of military activity and military spending, this seems to be a key indicator of what's going on in this graph. And it'll be interesting to hear what James's thoughts on that are. So the last bit of data I want to show you is comparing the data that the Ministry of Defence reports in its annual reports on military greenhouse gas emissions, compared with how the data is classified in UN country reports. So we've got two graphs there. The one on the right is the UN graph. And you can see that it's between 56 and 66% of the figures that the MOD are reporting. Yes, there are certain reasons, particularly on scope 2, where scope 2 doesn't tend to be reported within. It tends to be reported as electricity generation, but even allowing for that, the differences there, they show that there's a significant gap, and we would like to see better transparency so that shows up in the UN figures. And again, the UK tends to be one of the better ones in reporting, so the situation is worse, as Lindsay was talking about, from many other countries. So key conclusions are, we've seen some large reductions in military emissions, both stationary and mobile, over the last 15 to 30 years or so, but there's not a great deal of evidence that particular measures like military energy efficiency programs or military climate measures have been large contributors to this. And it seems to be a lot of other factors, the smaller size or activity of the military or civilian actions. And then another point about underreporting of data in the UN figures. And so there are a couple of final thoughts, which, with an eye on the discussion in the final panel around. So GHG emissions from UK military bases, there are a lot of clear reduction pathways for these. There's a lot of widely available technology that could be deployed, things like insulating buildings or low energy equipment, IT, light bulbs, but solar panels, heat pumps could make a major difference. And a lot of these would lead to fuel savings and cost savings. And I think there's a much clearer path you can see around those emissions. And so there's a strong argument for having high reduction targets for up to up to 2030 or so. And I would argue that the MOD needs to be looking at least 90% for that period. For military equipment, it's much more difficult against the background of international arms races, military spending increases, and a whole host of technological obstacles to low carbon equipment. And again, we're going to talk about that much more in the final session. The technological options are much more difficult, which, and as Neta mentioned as well, I think we need to look far more at changes to military strategy and security strategy, and I think particularly looking more at tackling the underlying roots of conflict, and that's how we need, and that needs far more consideration in discussions of this sort. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Yeah, really good to drill down into a bit more detail. I look forward to the day where we have this kind of level of information for every country in the world. It would be really nice. I think one of our thing we'd like to pursue, certainly as a research group, is to make connections with others in other countries who can start to drill down into some of this data and get hold of it, just to give us a clearer global idea, because all countries are so different. The next speaker will be Oliver Heidrich from the University of Newcastle. Oliver is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Newcastle University. He's a principal investigator of the Vital Living Lab at RAF Leeming, and will now drill down even further, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, that's me. Yes. That's me. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a civil engineer, just a little bit about myself. I'm a civil engineer and I work at Newcastle University for the last few years as a professor in civil and environmental engineering. And I work on climate change mitigation and adaptation. I'm also the director of the Vital Living Lab, which is what I will talk about today. And I want to develop theories and I want to make interventions that respond to the challenges and the opportunities that climate change is bringing with you guys, okay? And that's why you need to work with me. I have chocolates. Okay, and my apologies for Owen gets because he's working very hard on the technology. My apologies for the people online. I hope you can hear me. And I also have goodies for other things. Please do take these materials because we are wanting to work with you, okay? This is why we engage with you. So what do? I do climate change mitigation and adaptation, and this is underpinned by material flow analysis, life cycle assessment we heard earlier. Also, I develop sustainable solutions. I've been a director of companies who have done this. And why am I doing this? Because I want society, industry, and government to understand the impact of their actions or indeed the inactions. Inactions is if you don't switch off the light, that's an inaction, but it's causing consumption of energy, of course. And because I want to make this world an even better place. This is the whole idea for me, okay? And what I'm hearing a lot, because I've been working in industry for a long time, and in the last almost 10 years now at Newcastle University, evidence-based decision-making is really what I want to do. I want to provide people with the right data. Because if you cannot manage it, measure it, you cannot manage things. This is the basic principles. We have complex systems, but we need to have simple messages for government, but also for the public. And we need to have data and robust science underpinning all of this. But our understanding of all of this can be so different, because if I ask my civil engineering students what is 1 + 1, they would say it's obvious, it's 2. If I ask a physicist, they have shown mathematical proof, and this was Bertrand Russell and Whitehead, that it can't be anything else but 2. But they did a mathematical form which goes over 75 pages long. Okay, but then you can ask a psychologist, which you have seen, perhaps I've done my PhD in psychology, they would say, that's an interesting question. Why are you asking this question? What does it tell me about you? Okay, if you ask an architect, we work a lot with architects, they don't really care about this answer. They just want to make it look good. Okay, if you ask an economist, and I work with a lot of economists, they say, what do you want it to be? 1 + 1, I can make it anything you want it to be, okay? If you ask a statistician, there is a very high probability it will be 2, but we can't be certain. Taleb has shown this black swan event, okay? And now I work with the military for the last 3 years. I found there are 2 answers for the military. If it's in conflict times, they want 1 + 1, whatever keeps them alive. This is really important. But if you're asking military people, don't interfere with my. If you're asking peace times, and I've done this a few times now, 1 + 1, the people would say, whatever my superior tells me it should be, this is the answer. And that's why we have sometimes problems with data gathering. And so now we try to find always the evidence. And that's why I came up with this Vital Living Lab. We are conducting 6 different experiments to quantify the carbon reduction at a base, RAF Leeming. It's in the north of England. It's funded by the Defence Innovation Fund, and we look at different interventions, but we are not changing light bulbs. We are not installing standard equipment, or we're not telling people how to behave. This is a research project, but it provides hopefully the backbone to design and assess interventions towards net zero. And we have six different experiments, from carbon capture to electric cars or hydrogen cars, ground transport, photovoltaics. We also look at carbon, geothermal energies. We look at we assess all these technologies using life cycle assessment, or what is called prospective life cycle assessment. My research is mainly in life cycle assessment. And we do carbon accounting. And this is what I will tell you today about, because it's about these principles that we call bottom up and top down. We have top down the Paris Agreement, IPCC or UNFCCC, NATO, UK government, MOD, then the forces, and then you have individual bases which have to deal with the consequences of these top-down decisions. But you also have bottom-up, IF Leeming informing perhaps the IPCC and NATO and UNFCCC. This is what my job is, I can see as an academic, okay? And the Living Lab is a user-centric principle and methodology. We are listening to the users, we are engaging with the users at IF Leeming, but also people like you. This is why I still have these chocolates, okay? You get one because you're not for nightly all the time. Okay? I still have more chocolates, okay? These pockets are deep pockets, okay? And what we are doing is from here, we are doing these different methodologies in carbon accounting. We're using a mixed method. We're using databases, we're looking at records, we're doing site visits, we are having this principle of user-centric. But what you have, these principles are, you need to be accurate, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be transparent, consistent, and it has to be complete. And now we're coming to these different stages, how any company is doing this. I've done this for large companies for many, many years. And they do inventories, then they quantify, they report, then they monitor, going back, and then they validate and verify. And there are various standards out there, which we have heard our colleague already mentioning. From the ISO standards to the GHG protocol, all the way to PAS 2080 for carbon accounting, all the way to 1464, which is environmental product declaration forms, but also there are many other CDPs, GRI, International Energy Agency, so on and so forth. So which one should we use? Or indeed, as our colleague said, NATO is developing its own methodology. What we are doing is we're looking at these methodologies and we try to inform the decision maker. And what we do is we use a case study. That's IF Leeming. The base is 534 hectares. There are about 3,000 people working and living there, 2,000 people living there permanently. They have a building stock from ranging from 1938 to the year 2000. So it's quite an old building stock, but it's very representative of this country. But they have 400 buildings, hangars, and single living accommodation. Thank you, Kate. So my colleague tells me these are variations of stuff. They have everything from medical centers to barracks to hangars. And we look at these and we try to find, looking at this input, what is consumed, and then the output. This is a typical, what we call material flow accounting system, which is the very base for life cycle assessment, okay? And we go look at these inventories. This is the boring part, so I try to cheer you up with chocolates, okay? I give you one. Okay, you're looking so interested, right? This is the boring part because this is lots of data, okay? You will see the DIO, the Defense Infrastructure Organization, is providing lots of data. And we validate this data against what we're seeing at the meter reading. The problem you're having is the meter reading is not always at the building stage. It's very often at very at the entrance of the whole IF Leeming. So we need to disaggregate this, and that's why we take measurements. But these, you will find, is very similar to what Stuart just mentioned. Obviously, we should have maybe validated what he's showing, what I'm showing, because this is pretty much the same, but at the base. So the data shows you electricity is the greenhouse gas emissions. These are these lines are going down. The consumption is pretty much staying up. Obviously, we have a COVID situation here, which had an impact, of course. But you will see overall the trend is going down. And we had high emissions from electricity pre-COVID, after COVID, high emissions from natural gas. And you will see the greenhouse gas emissions reduced from 9,800 tons to 7,600. But these could be because of these emission factors, which are shown down here. And these emission factors are very important in the reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. The reason why, as Stuart has just mentioned, is because the grid has changed and it's keep changing. We are less reliant on coal. We are introducing more renewables, and therefore it's a natural decline of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, rather than the efforts on the base. And trust me, if you go to IF Leeming or any other base, I don't want, they have bad insulation, they have bad water provisions, they have bad heating, and it's really like an old housing stock. So I work with a lot of cities, and they do the same for the cities, and it's exactly the same problem. That's why I was so interested in using IF Leeming, because I see this as a petri dish for my research, because it is like representing the whole country. So what we are doing here, we are still working through this now. We have the scope, we set that, we did the inventories, we are calculating emissions. Now we're looking at the baseline and develop different scenarios. What interventions could be making the biggest savings? But remember, we are not changing light bulbs, because that's what consultants do. I don't want to compete with consultants. They are out there, and that's great. Is there any consultant in here? Somebody brave, come on. You already got a chocolate. There too. Are you one?
I'll sell it too.
No, absolutely right. This is what I should have put on my list for. What is 1 + 1? The consultant would have. I have that. I don't know the answer, but if you know the answer, let me know, and I make lots of money out of it. That's what the consultant is. No disrespect, of course. But also what we're trying to show is the living lab methodology working? So this is research we are doing. Can we actually engage with the users? And please do come. We have open events in April and in October. Or now it's in November. It's the end of 27th October, yes. So please do come. If you want invitation, speak to Kate. She puts you on invitation list, okay? Ultimately, what we are having is we had, and I have evidence for this because I've done this now for many years. I know that the cities and EU country comparison I've done over the last few years, the UK was leading in Europe, not in the world, in terms of what they're delivering and their ambition. But maybe some of this is just due to the emission factors. And I can tell, as you have figured out, I'm obviously not from England, I'm from Germany. In Germany, it's exactly the same. Emission factors are changing. That's why the greenhouse gas emissions going down in Germany or in other countries. But we have evidence that since Paris, other countries are decarbonizing much faster and are just as ambitious as our country. In the military context, we are still leading. And I know this because I work with colleagues in Germany, I work with colleagues in the US, in Japan. But we are jeopardizing this position because Sarah Ashby is over there. We have had a very nice chat when she was visiting us in Newcastle, and we know this is jeopardizing our leading position right now. And that we need to have this global stocktake, this great work which Stuart, Doug, and Lindsay are doing, which informs the UNFCCC. And so there's much more work needed. With the policymakers, we want to inform the IPCC, the NATO, the UK government. We need to speak with the users, but ultimately what we need is commitment. And this is what last week's announcement was really shooting ourselves in the foot. I'm trying not to swear because we're really upset about this announcement from Rishi Sunak last week. How we are changing our policies all of a sudden. But we need to commit, we need to measure, we need to design, we need to engage, we need to understand the consequences. This is the intended and unintended consequences. This is what life cycle assessment is about. Then we need to implement, then we need to review, and then we need to adjust, and we go back to this. This is a circle, and that's what's called the PDCA cycle from Demning, the plan, do, check, act cycle. And that's what I want to do. And there's so much more. We need to think about climate change adaptation as well. The military can be leading in adaptation. They are very often the last defense. If there's a flooding event, you first call the police, then you call the fire brigade, and all of those are already busy. You call the military. And that's why they need to really understand what climate change adaptation is. But ultimately, we need to convince all of them that 1 + 1 still equals 2. Because a lot of people look at evidence differently. And there's so much more. Please do get in touch with me. Talk to me today. Write me an email because I want to make this world an even better place. And I want you to come with me on this journey. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. I gave you an extra minute there for chocolate-based antics.
Thank you.
On the subject of chocolate, and before we move to Switzerland. Our next speaker will be Dr. Axel Michaelowa. He's worked on international climate policy instruments and the UNFCCC process since 1994. And he's a senior founding partner of Perspectives and part-time researcher at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Zurich, Switzerland. And Axel's going to kind of provide some context to this locally gathered, nationally gathered data and how it might look at the international level in the context of the UNFCCC and IPCC. Axel, you have the floor. Stuart, can we just switch
Yep.
places?
Thank you. We just need my slides. So before the slides are coming up, I just want to say I can't win the chocolate competition. And I think
You just have to get.
No, you have to go out. This is my what's called appendix.
Good. Perfect. So I want to talk about global stocktake. The term has already been mentioned. So I will first look into what actually does the global stocktake do under the UNFCCC. Then I want to look backwards. What have we seen globally? And of course, we've already heard presentations from various people who've contributed a lot to this looking backwards. And then I want to look forward and also give some recommendations for the Conference of the Parties that is upcoming in Dubai. And you see here two images. You see one image which shows the report I did for Tipping Point North-South in 2022, which was actually updating a paper I wrote in 2001 in the journal Climatic Change on accounting of military and conflict-related emissions. At that point in time, no one was interested. I never got any feedback. And I thought, well, this is a topic, apparently it's too theoretical. People don't care for it. And of course, now I'm thrilled to see more than 20 years later, a room full of 40 people and 100 people discussing this. So I'm really glad that the community has come up. And I also have put my title slide of a side event I did in 1999 in the COP on accounting of emissions under the UNFCCC from military activities and conflicts. So we had done the theoretical assessment of different cases. We, I think, had probably 20 participants. Again, I got the feeling, well, this is a topic which is not worth pursuing further. But again, I'm happy that now we have the critical mass to pursue this topic. So, well, the slides look a bit different from what I actually submitted. All my formatting has gone, but well, it's not pretty, but let's continue regardless, because usually my logos should appear and they don't. So the global stocktake actually is to take every 5 years a summary of where we stand with regards to global greenhouse gas emissions. And with regard to the target of the Paris Agreement that says that in the second half of the century, we should achieve net zero emissions globally. And that, of course, underpins the 1.5 to 2 degree target of the Paris Agreement. Of course, there is a lot of debate what the global stocktake actually should entail. There was a process to submit from observer organizations, NGOs, universities, and so on. More than 1,000 submissions have been made. Well, this doesn't look pretty. I must really say I'm disappointed what you've made out of my slide. No, really. What we have done in the past is actually that, of course, the military emissions in peacetime, they are a relevant aspect of international emissions. Data are patchy. You've heard from Stuart, you've heard from Neta. These are the key researchers who have gone into that. We have now these ideas that about 1 to 5% of global annual emissions are coming from the standard operations of military. Of course, if you have strong conflicts, that can multiply significantly. And of course, we have very patchy reporting of countries under the UNFCCC, but this has been also stated by CEOPS. If we now look at the magnitude of these emissions, of course, we need to state that there are big differences depending on the events. So we have heard about armies in peacetime. I won't go into detail that. If we look into what are the emissions of burning a big city, there are nice studies from Hamburg 1943, firebombing, which would give about 10 to 20 million tons of CO2 for such destruction. Then, of course, we have the big emission events in Kuwait, the first invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, generating about 400 billion tons CO2 equivalent. Similar order of magnitude for the forest destruction in the Vietnam War. So these are probably the biggest single conflict-related emissions events. And of course, we have Leonard's work in Ukraine that specifies very nicely the different sources of conflict-related emissions there. And just as comparison, the emissions of Switzerland are approximately 50 million tons per year and going downward. So what does this mean in the context of the UNFC accounting? So far, of course, the accounting allows not to report due to confidentiality reasons. And this confidentiality clause has been reinforced under the Paris Agreement due to the insistence of China and other large countries, also, of course, US, but I think US was hiding nicely behind the big bag of China. We have, of course, the standard exemption of the so-called bunker fuels, which means fuels used for transportation by ships and planes in international territory are not counted under the national totals. And we know that this was brought in by the US in the Kyoto negotiations because the US military, of course, has a large share of its emissions in this category and didn't want to account for it. We then have a very specific clause under the Kyoto Protocol that exempts emissions from operations pursuant to the UN Charter. Now, of course, not all conflicts are done under the UN Charter, but of course, a significant share of emissions of military falls under this exemption. And then, of course, we have the bases. We've discussed emissions of bases, and usually bases just are reported by the host country. I'm not aware of specific treaties between host countries of bases and the country that actually operates the base, but principally, of course, there should be an agreement how to deal with those emissions. And then we have the big issue of occupied territory. Now I like your change because it's blue and yellow, showing Ukrainian colors. Original colors were different. We have very interesting discussions at a side event at the last COP in Egypt, where the Moldavian government, for example, stated that it painstakingly looks at the statistical yearbook of Transnistria, occupied by Russian forces, to actually calculate in very much detail the emissions of their territory and to account for it. And I asked the Moldovan government, why do you put such an effort into that? Why don't you just say, look, the Russians occupied this territory, so they should be accountable for that? And they said, no, we want to have the sovereignty on this territory, and therefore we want to show that we account as good as we can. Similar things by Ukraine and Georgia. They didn't do so much effort to calculate the emissions, but they also want to claim and continue to claim the emissions of the occupied territory. So we are stuck, getting even more interesting. Good. Sorry. Good. So let's look forward now. How can we look into it in the future? So we urgently need to improve the reporting under the UNFC, specifically under the Paris Agreement. There is a so-called enhanced transparency framework under which it can be done. So that, of course, we should cover both the direct emissions and the indirect emissions during the conflicts. We should ask the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the guardian of the rules for national inventories, to actually change the rules. This is a process that has been undertaken several times in the past, for example, for swamps and wetlands. And therefore, it could be easy in principle to now have a revision to take into account the military emissions. It just needs a few countries that make a submission to the IPCC governing bodies, the Bureau, And then, of course, it will be discussed in the IPCC plenary. And if agreed, then the report would be written within 2 to 3 years. So there are precedents, and these precedents should be taken up by requesting such a special report. We should also then work on making clear that in peace settlements of the future, emissions play a role, and that the responsibility of the aggressor, the occupier, should clearly be taken up. So to end with my recommendations for the conference in Dubai, so that there should be a section in the backward-looking report on the global stocktake covering what we know about the level of military and conflict-related emissions in the past. Of course, that means there is now still a window of opportunity for us, for the community, to engage with the presidency of the COP to push this topic. And of course, look into the numbers that all of us know. And then there should be a section in the forward-looking part of the stocktake, the so-called roadmap, the plan for inclusion of military and conflict-related emissions in national inventory guidelines under IPCC, and also that there should be a COP decision regarding coverage of conflict-related emissions. And I know a few people in this room are pushing this behind the scenes, openly. I think we now have a critical mass in this community to really make ourselves heard in the international process. We should not drown in the cacophony of voices shown here, because there are many interests in the global stocktake, but I think our voice can be heard, and let's work for it. Thank you.
Go on, school. I'm just going to plug it in. No, I can't plug it on. It'll be so much trouble. So I'm going to go old school.
Okay.
Properly old school.
Brilliant. Thank you, Axel. Our next speaker is Lo-Fi James Clare from the MOD. He's a director of Levelling Up, the Union Climate Change and Sustainability. Presumably has enormous business cards. On climate change and sustainability, he's responsible for Defence's overarching approach to climate mitigation and adaptation activity, reporting and developing Defence's environmental operating model and environmental protection. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm glad you got a chocolate.
Thank you. I'm going to eat the chocolate once I think about how to deal with each one of those three pressures from the previous three panel members. So apologies, I have had to go lo-fi for a whole host of reasons, but if I plug my MOD laptop into a Zoom account, then I wouldn't be coming back, I think, to this event, full stop. So yes, so I'll start off with actually the journey that was taken, and I think it touches a bit on what Stuart was talking about. So yes, the MOD, as well as all other government departments, and there is going to be a running theme through some of this in terms of what the UK is meant to be doing, have been reporting our emissions through the Greening Government Commission commitments. Those Greening Government commitments are run by DEFRA. Those commitments are across MOJ, DFT, DFE, and the rest, and they are primarily focused on our estate. They are not the full extent of our emissions. They don't cover off our capability emissions, so the use of our fuel, for instance. They don't cover off some of the wider scope 3 emissions that were mentioned as well from previous speakers in terms of commuting, service families accommodation, or SLAM, as was being discussed there. So there's a whole raft of stuff in terms of where the reporting is for central government that we are abiding by, but gives us some of those gaps in potentially our reporting that I think Lindsay was mentioning before. Hence the question on, are there actually gaps in military emissions, or are there gaps in actually how we report greenhouse gas emissions full stop? We, in terms of UKMD, took the decision 2 years ago, and as reported by Stuart, in terms of revalidating, rebaselining our own emissions. Because isn't that the first thing that we all do, any organisation does, to actually figure out how it's going to decarbonise? And with an organisation which is as complex and as large as Defence, you have to have a firmer baseline to base those decisions on, because then that actually drives some of the actual change that we can actually go away and do. Again, I'm just playing a little bit in terms of the previous presentations. So we look at our built estate, okay? our built estate and indeed the entire public sector has very clear targets. Stuart mentioned some of those before. They were mentioned as well by our House of Commons Defence Committee. So by 2025, against a 17-18 baseline, I think it is, we should have reduced our emissions by 30% by 2025. That's not just the MOD, that is essentially across the entire government estate and indeed some of the local authorities as well. By 2032, we should have reduced it by 50%, and by 2037, we should have reduced it by 75%. And by 2050, that's the net zero, the netting out in terms of that built estate. Now, again, that is a public sector commitment that defence has to abide by. A building is a building. If we're being asked to decarbonise, defence should decarbonise the buildings. Stuart's already outlined, and actually, to be fair, so did you, that many of these technologies already exist, heat pumps, etc., etc. Now, for defence as well, when we actually look at what we're doing, yes, the grid is decarbonising, but defence also has the need to probably be energy resilient and energy secure. So what we're trying to do is balance up the need to actually decarbonise against those targets. There's also the need to actually generate our own energy as well, to actually do the resilience of our estate and our establishments. Now, I would argue that solar PV at scale, because the grid is going green, isn't about emissions, it is about energy and energy resilience. So again, I have to balance off two separate pressures on the department, one to decarbonise and one to actually look at energy. And that's just in the estate. Go across to our capabilities. It is true to say defence, as similar to other militaries, most of our emissions actually are generated from aviation. I think out of the 3.14 million tonnes that we reported from our Scope 1, Scope 2 and elements of Scope 3, I think the Royal Air Force is about 1.1 million tonnes of those, and pretty much aviation out of all our total is also 1.1 million tonnes, and that's because the Royal Navy operates assets as well as our Strategic Command. So again, you were talking a little bit before about that forward look. What we've done is actually started to map our own emission generating sectors, aviation, maritime, exactly the same as in the wider UK net zero strategy, and looked at what those decarbonisation trajectories could look like theoretically. The question is we've actually gotten, as Stuart actually outlined at the start, is that we've already capitalised our fleets. We already have 2 carriers. We're probably not going to bring them into dock to look at basically ripping out the engine and replacing it by something else. So for us, looking at different fuel types and alternative energy types are really quite important. For all those that don't know, in the Royal Air Force, we've flown the first ever synthetic fuel flight 2 years ago. And that's essentially fuel from direct air capture. We've looked at sustainable aviation fuel. All of our fleets already are certified to use 50% sustainable aviation fuel. That's already good to go. So we're actually waiting, in essence, for some of the sustainable aviation fuel mandates, that is the UK mandate, so for us to actually pull on those emissions. So we're ready to go, and we've actually led the way in terms of some of the militaries. Going back to the rebaselining of our emissions, yes, there was a jump, but we rebaselined our emissions. So we report our global emissions. Because why would we report anything else? Because we're responsible for those emissions. So we've made sure that we're reporting 100% of our UK bases. We've made sure that we're reporting all our capabilities regardless of where we are. So we've used those inventory stocks to essentially understand what our emissions are each year. And yes, as well, due to the analysis, and I would like to go back through those slides, op tempo is really important. So for instance, if we have a carrier strike group going out 1 year, then obviously our emissions are going to go up because we've got a carrier strike group going out. So we have to play with those actual fluctuations, play with what those alternative energy sources are, look at the risks to defence, and they're not just the risks of mitigation, they're the risks of adaptation. The world is going to change around defence. We know we have to adapt defence, but we also know that we have to preserve our capabilities because the world is going to become inherently more insecure. So again, we're trying to balance up what our approach is with all those pressures. And I think Neta said right at the very start that there's a conflict as well. Sorry, there's a growing nexus between climate change and security, which is another policy area that I own. So with all of that, there are quite a lot of factors to actually pull together to think about the approach. But we have to take the top-down pressure, we have to take the bottom-up pressure to actually start to define what our investment strategies are, how we're going to take account of those choices to actually move forward. But again, we've got a whole raft of other priorities that play a mix. But where we have very clear targets, we are going to go away and hit those targets. Our greening government commitments are open source, they're publicly available, performance is monitored. I think in the introduction, you mentioned that I was responsible for the environmental operating model. So we are strengthening our governance as well. We've got something called the Defence Safety and Environment Committee that is looking at overseeing our performance to, again, ensure that the right things are being done at the right time. So it's not just all through grid being greened. We've actually looked at how to disaggregate our targets as well. We've done the rebaselining. So I can sit here and I've already told you that the Royal Air Force is 1.1 million tonnes, so around just under a third of our emissions. I can tell you the Royal Navy is about 650,000 tonnes. So we've actually started to disaggregate those targets out to actually try to drive direct emission reduction. And indeed, our green and government commitments have a 10% direct emission target as well as part and parcel of it, which goes out to 2025. So we are making changes. But again, I'll come back to defence is reflective of any large-scale organisation. I'll also come back to say that defence is reflective of the wider UK society. So again, we are taking the approach of a wider macro level department. So we're looking at decarbonising before we start talking about offsetting, because we also have 1% of the UK. So we can actually sequester some of our carbon, but also at the same time, we have our land for certain reasons. So we own the Salisbury Plain Training Area. Salisbury Plain Training Area is actually one of the biggest triple SIs, so sites of special scientific interest in the UK. It's calcified grassland, so we can't tree plant on that. But where we have Otterburn Training Camp, which has peat, we can look at essentially re-wetting our peat. But all of that is taken into the mix because that is the approach of a large-scale complex organisation that has emissions in every sector to actually go away and think about what the climate risks are to our outputs in terms of how we operate, where we operate, who we operate with, as well as to actually how we look about actually mitigating our activity, as well as then understanding as well that when we actually drive some of that, there are risks and other vulnerabilities that might emerge. So we have to think things through holistically, think through with our allies and partners, because we are going to operate and need to be interoperable with allies and partners going forward. It's just the way of the world. So again, you know, pressures from Stuart, pressures up from Oliver, the championing as well in terms of the UN FCC, all of those are pressures that we have to take into account to actually go away and deliver our own approach to decarbonisation and adapting to the impact of climate change. Sorry, that was without notes.
Excellent. Sterling work without notes. I did it in the end. Excellent. We have 20 minutes for questions, 21 in fact, which ain't bad going. I'm actually going to do chair's prerogative and ask a question which I think speaks to some of these, and it's to you, James. It's about transparency in emissions reporting. And one of the objections, as Axel was saying, from UNFCCC, is the issue of confidentiality over this kind of data. Have there been any sort of concerns within MOD about publishing data on emissions in terms of it might give away sensitive information around fuel use and capabilities and things? Do you think that's something which is justified by those states, or do you think it's just a kind of knee-jerk response from militaries who aren't very enthusiastic about sharing information generally?
I can't answer that question in terms of other militaries, but I can say that when it comes to our own emissions, our key consideration is making sure that we're actually reporting from an assured data source like any other organisation. So I think Oliver was mentioning before that, you know, automatic meter readings, you know, are probably at the establishment level, they're not at the asset level. So when we're actually looking at our reporting, because we publicly report it in our accounts, you know, we have to be confident in that data, and that's the conversation that we essentially have. It's how comfortable and confident we are. But I was speaking to Lucy before, but essentially, it's incumbent on any organisation when they actually go through everything to always look at the methodologies, improve the methodologies, drive things forward, because every year you understand more. And we need to make sure that we are improving every year. But we did a big, massive rebaselining effort to actually underpin it. But now the thing is at what point do we actually stop? At what point is that good enough data to drive and underscore our decarbonisation work or understand what climate risks are? Because I don't think you have to account for every ton of carbon. And therefore, where is that balance? Because otherwise, we do reporting and don't necessarily do it.
Thank you very much. I will open the floor on that and take the first three questions. I'll take Emmanuel, I'll take the back row, and I'll take you, Leonard. Emmanuel.
Thanks so much. It's a bit more remark than a question. I would like to continue on something that Oliver said that at the end of his very interesting presentation. They were all very interesting, but what Oliver said at the end, the moment that something happens, you call the police, you call other ones, and finally you call the military. And there we have a problem. Not that you call the military, but the problem is that all over Europe, every time that something happens, suddenly the day after in the morning, oh, let's send out the military because we have them anyway. They have equipment, so let's send out the military. The main problem is there that in most of the cases, the military has like equipment for that, training, education for it, and are just used because they are there. So it's not a structural thing. It's every time an ad hoc situation. We lost only this year in Greece more than 5 people from the military due to missions in the field of climate change. 2 pilots when there were the fires. We have 5 people in Libya, where international media were not even saying that it were military. They said 8 helpers died, 5 people from the military. So we are really calling on making this structural. We are not calling on not dealing with that by the military, but make it structural. And there is even a European Union point that we would like to raise. I'm in the wrong country to say something about the European Union, but since that the UK is out of the European Union, the collaboration on defense is even much more than it was ever before. So let's keep it a little bit like this for the moment. But climate is very high and it's really coming out clearly out of the strategic compass of the European Union. Also, the concept of NATO. So why don't we create on the European level a kind of climate military organization that can be deployed quite quickly instead of waiting countries to send out 5 generators, 10 buckets with water and whatever. No, a European unit, a Frontex climate from the European Union. So our call is really educate the military, give them the proper equipment, give them the training, make it structural, and let's see if we cannot do that not only on the national level, but on a broader perspective. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Emmanuel. On the back row, yeah.
Hello,
Do you want to say your name and where you're from?
Yeah.
And probably speak up a little bit so the mic can hear you.
So that's easier. My name's John. I work for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. Just very briefly on that last one, it doesn't actually have to be a military force. It's great to hear from colleagues in Austria and other spaces of civilian services that could offer a very similar thing rather than defaulting to military chain of command as being the only way. So let's think creatively. My question is for both our representative from the Ministry of Defence, but also the broader panel, including our friend online from the States. If we recognise we're in an era of constrained resources, both economic and carbon, and recognise the results of that is increased conversation about how we use those resources, I'm getting very challenged and frustrated by what feels like a network of smoke and mirrors that leads to civil society having to join the dots when it comes to the reporting and information about the military emissions of the actual fighting of war. If we look at our own government here in the UK, it's quite easy to find out we have committed 4.6 billion in military assistance to Ukraine. But you could probably delve in and find out what that translates into. But what there isn't the same public conversation about, which I think we should be encouraging, is what is the climate impact of that aid? Because the climate impact of warfare lasts a lot longer than the moment the bomb is dropped. The climate impact in the South Pacific, where Britain tested its nuclear weapons, is still a live issue, but we don't talk about that. So I'd like to pose both a challenge and a question, which is how can we increase transparency around the carbon impact of the weapons of war? And with the UK being one of the largest militaries, how can we as a country lead, recognizing there is also longer term work required at UN level?
I'd like to turn to Neta first. Neta, did you catch that question? So it's quite far away from the microphone.
Yes.
We can't hear.
Essentially,
Just
can
to-
you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. So essentially the question was about the long-term impact of war emissions. I didn't catch all of it, so just could you summarize it? Can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay.
The question was, how can we increase transparency in issues around providing military aid to conflict areas, with the example of Ukraine, for example, where there isn't enough question or knowledge about what the carbon cost of those decisions are?
Okay, I'll take it in two chunks here. I think first of all, we haven't talked about the emissions of contractors that are performing military functions, and some of the decrease in emissions, the secular decline in emissions for the UK military, for the US military, is in fact due to the use of contractors performing functions that were once provided by militaries. That is, both operational functions and sort of providing functions like cooking and training. So these need to be included in our understanding of what the emissions are. That may or may not be a large portion, but I think that's off. And then in terms of general transparency, there is a law in the United States that these emissions need to be reported. Again, not everything is reported. And in fact, even when Congress got a report of 10 years of military emissions, that was not made public. I only saw it because a journalist got it and sent it to me. This should be public. All of these reports and information should be public. That's all I can say about that. It's a should. It'd be nice. And then we need more details. But I have other things to say about other issues. Go on.
Excellent. Cool. John Chancellor. Perspective.
To what end is a bit of it. So, to what end? So, there's a bit of me that basically wants to say that we're essentially here because we live in a rules-based order and are able to have this debate. But it comes back to what are you trying to achieve and why? Because the world is going to get more insecure. Neta said it herself. We can argue or not about it. But what are you trying to achieve and why? And there are pressure points within the system. It might not actually be a defense one. So I agree, defense should be the last port of call. So you go through diplomacy and development first, that is the way it works. It's 3Ds. So why, and then also thinking about going back to Neta's point, there's a degree of what reporting should we be doing anyway, and therefore you're left with what is the, and I think you call it scope 3, don't you, Stuart? It's 3 plus, yeah. Which is, I don't think it's a recognised element of any reporting, and I would argue that things like wildfires, full stop, are not actually part of reporting as part of GHDs. So there's a whole raft of things that you could do that could be picked up by different reporting anyway, because there's wildfires in Canada, Greece has wildfires all over the place, Ukraine has wildfires. So there's other elements to basically pick up some of the issues that you're talking about without actually focusing directly on the wild military emissions, because you might not necessarily get the answer. I just don't.
I need to intervene here. It's really important. Twice now you've mischaracterized my remarks. I did not say that the world is necessarily going to be more conflict prone. That is not a foregone conclusion. What we see is the war waxes and wanes depending on many factors. The argument that I was raising before was about the connection that folks are drawing, both in the military and NGO community, between climate change and conflict. There are many intervening variables between climate change caused insecurity and stresses and conflict, and we don't have to go to war necessarily as a result of either scarcity or migration, or the rush for resources. And the causes of war are much more complex. We don't have to be there. So I just want to be very clear on that. I'm not suggesting that the world will be more conflict prone. Many things will determine the level of conflict.
Yeah, I'm actually going to open up to more questions, simply because I think the climate security people and the conversations they've been having have been talking about this for 15 years, 20 years, and have been having a lot of very high profile, very glamorous conferences. And with croissants that aren't in plastic wrapping. And I would say that actually we need to be talking about emissions because they've been ignored from these climate security debates and conversations. So I'm going to open up the floor to another question. If anybody has one. That one there, thank you. And then
earlier this year, the government reduced the foreign aid budget and bought extra nuclear weapons. Yet on the government website, it said that investment in measures to mitigate the effects or the future effects of global warming and therefore avoiding conflict is 20 to 50 times better value than other measures, like military intervention. That's on the government website. I was wondering how would you comment on that?
Forgive me, but that's a statement. So it's on the government website, and if you want
I
to,
think you said that the military was necessary to. There were risks out there that only the military could counter, and therefore that was the way to go.
No, I said I'm agreeing exactly with what Neta was saying, which is, and actually is defense. Sorry, defense is the last D. You go through your diplomacy. Well, you go through your development, your diplomacy, and then hopefully the last resort is defense.
It's not the last resort when you cancel the aid budget.
So if you want to, unfortunately, if you want to speak about the international climate funds and all that kind of stuff, you better speak to my Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office colleagues.
Give a more direct question. So we had good data showing that the main drivers of the emissions from UK military are aviation and shipping. We were saying those things we've got long lead times on that equipment. So they're going to be using liquid oil for the time being, and pretty much the only alternative to that in the short term is biofuel. Mentioned that kind of one of the things we're waiting for is the SAF sustainable fuel mandate. We know, Finlay, Asher, and I work in the aviation sector. We think it's very high risk that we will be able to deliver what the government is hoping it will deliver by 2030. We're looking at 10% fuel in civil aviation. There's studies that show 5% is incredibly difficult. So we're talking about, I think a lot of people have said, scarce resource and competition over those resources. It's a major driver of conflict and also energy prices and cost of living. So when you look at your UK aviation and shipping for 2030, and you think that's the main decarbonisation option, is incredibly scarce resource, do you see that as very high risk, that you'll be in competition and you just simply won't be able to get the feedstock and the fuel? Yeah, the question is, do you see that as a high risk on your kind of threats to delivery?
So I see the worldwide transition and how quickly we transit to, and that's also the production of hydrocarbons, whichever form they are, as being one of the potential opportunities for innovation, but also it's one of the potential risks in terms of, like I mentioned before, about the risk of defence being left behind. So you could foresee a scenario where I think the US have already started to talk about electrification of the tactical vehicles, for instance. So how do you have a mixed fleet where the risks are? How do you actually gain the energy sources for all of that? I can see all of that in terms of the scenarios that we're all facing, be it a 1.5 degree world, a 2 degree, a 4 degree world. There's all part and parcel of factors that need to be considered, because it's even more interesting than that when you get back down to it in terms of where's the land use going to come from in order to provide the feedstock. So there's a whole raft of complexities within all of it to essentially show that, you know, the markets are yet to be developed to drive some of the stuff that needs to actually be done to go away and deliver some of the targets that are actually out there. But we're ready to basically use SAF. We've procured SAF. We are using SAF. We've flown with SAF.
So have you got identified a high risk of delivery of SAF scale up?
We have identified the fact that we want to use SAF. We are working with our suppliers to use SAF. We're aware of the fact that the manufacturing capacity is not there. We've actually experienced that in terms of how we've done our pilot projects. And again, that's all part and parcel of it, but we're ready when the actual markets are. And of course, we use the fuel from the domestic pipeline around the UK. So we'll score how the actual GHG reporting works is you score the actual fuel that comes out of the actual system. So the blend is actually, whether we bought SAF or not, the blend is all. You're asking me about a government policy and defence.
I'm asking defence decarbonisation roadmaps, but presumably you're accountable for.
Yeah.
Do you not have a high risk of delivery failure due to supply risks elsewhere?
So
based on everything you just said.
Yeah, indeed. But you're also then presuming that I've got a net zero target for defence.
Well, that's my question to you before, which I was looking for an answer.
So that question is, we've agreed to fully contribute because we actually have emissions in every sector, and we are a heavily carbon intensive industry. We actually have capitalized our fleets. You know, we are trying to do what society is asking us to do and be ready for it. But your question is also not just linked to us, but it's linked to BA Systems, Virgin Atlantic, and all those. Have they done it? And the answer from the commercial perspective will be the same answer from the defence perspective.
I can answer for the US too.
Got time for one more question.
Neta is
Oh, sorry. Is
something.
that Neta? Sorry, Neta.
Yeah, it just really quickly.
Give us one moment while Owen connects you.
Am I connected now? Okay. So the US Navy has, with the Great Green Fleet, used beef fat as 10% of the fuel that is rendered beef fat. Right. There is a large reservoir, if one were to use it, of food waste that can be converted to alternative fuels. I don't think the supply is the issue. The US, for example, flew alternative fuel aircraft in 2008, 2009. It's the long lead times which are identified. And the fact that it takes 10 to 15 years to produce a ship or design an aircraft, research, test and evaluate that aircraft, and then build it, and then you're stuck with it, and then conversion. So it's really a very long-term process, but I don't think that supply of fuel is the sticking point. I think it's organizational and infrastructural.
Thank you very much, Neta. We're now at 1:45, which I believe from Ellie is conclusion of this session. Thank you very much. Thank you much to our speakers and our panel. Thank you much for James for coming and being here to take these questions. I'm sure I'd be happy to chat about them more over lunch. Happy in the loosest possible sense of the term. But yeah, thank you very much. Lunch is downstairs, in the room downstairs. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to everyone who's been following along at home.